Hello, hello, hello. This is Teresa Lynn Crockett, and I am learning to find my voice. I'll just be totally honest with you. And I'm here today with Tammy from Vetus Living, and we've been having this conversation a few times behind the scenes. So we just thought, what the heck? Like, this is a great opportunity to record this conversation and put it out there for any other women out there, and possibly men too, who are struggling or in the process of growing and finding their voice. So, hi, Tammy. Thanks for being with me today. Please introduce yourself.
Morning, Teresa. I'm Tammy from Vetus Living, and I've been in health and wellness for over 30 years and have recently transitioned into design and started a community for women. And because we've been having this conversation, I thought we've got to have this conversation and help other women with some steps to finding their voice, because I've made lots of mistakes along the way myself.
And that's par for the course. And I think, if not, like mistakes are the best darn lessons, but when you're doing them, they're like, ah.
Oh, yes. When it comes to finding your voice, I think the toughest thing. So initially in my process, finding my voice really started with understanding myself and paying very close attention to the way I was feeling, because I had learned when I was very small. And I think a lot of women have gone through this, where, it kind of goes back to that old way that people used to raise their kids, in the sense that children are seen and not heard.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that sadly, that goes double for women, especially of certain generations, right? Mm-hmm. And so finding my voice, I had to first, because of invalidation and maybe not feeling like I mattered so much through the growing up process, I had to figure out what I wanted and needed, and how did I feel, and was this right or wrong for me? And that took a lot of soul searching. Actually, a book that was really helpful along the way was called Deeper Dating. And though you would imagine it's about dating, it's really about understanding yourself and the gifts that you have to contribute to the world first. And until you find those gifts and acknowledge them and then appreciate them, you can never find your voice, because instead you're reflecting everybody else's voice, especially if you're like a people pleaser, or you fall into some of those coping dependency patterns that a lot of women or even men fall into as they grow up and until they become adults.
I'm just like listening and just taking this all in right now, because everything you're saying is just a reminder for myself. I know I definitely benefit from these continual reminders of, yes, it is about self-discovery and about finding your gifts and finding your passions, because it's like almost, it makes sense that you don't know what to say until you've done the internal work and the processing work. And I know with myself, like, I'm a journal junkie. Mm-hmm. So I have been, I have my journal like right over here next to me. It's like a third arm, and I go through about one a year. That's like 300 some pages. And because nothing has supported me in really understanding what's going on in here and getting it out. A lot of times it's like we do the people pleasing, we do the externalizing of our own worth, trying to get that validation from other people, because we just don't know how to explore it within. It's very meaningful and scary and sometimes just like, just really terrifying work to really reflect on yourself.
Well, I think the toughest thing for some people, and this is what I found with myself, I grew up in a not so great home environment, and I was invalidated a lot. And I think that at one point in time in history, that again, it's that generational thing where, children, are seen and not heard. There is a lot of invalidation, like I'm hungry, or I'm tired, or I'm this, or I'm that. And you start expressing yourself naturally as a child. But then your parents say, no, you're not, just sit down. No, you're not, be quiet. No, and whatever that might be. That was my home environment. It's not everyone's home environment, but I think everyone can kind of understand that to some degree, because everyone has experienced invalidation at some point in time in their life. And the problem with invalidation is it kind of ties into gaslighting, in the sense that you are being told that what you feel and what you think doesn't exist, or it doesn't matter. And when you're told that enough as you're growing up, whether you're in a healthy environment or a non-healthy environment, or in the workforce as an adult, or, you know, in a position of, like, you know, right now we're going through this thing with Black Lives Matter, same thing, right? It's a power thing. It's a non-empathetic thing. We're not empathizing or perspective taking with other people and understanding that they are separate entities from ourselves. They're separate beings. They have separate needs. And so for me, the toughest thing was to first recognize that I do have needs, and I need to understand what those needs are. And it's okay to have needs. And then the next step is expressing it. So then that can really be a challenge. And you and I have had that conversation before on all the things that can happen when you
it's like the
begin.
slingshot effect. Yeah.
Right, right. And so maybe we could, you know, I think what might be helpful is to talk about when you don't have a voice, how that impacts your life, and kind of express some experiences so that other people can maybe understand what that means and how that impacts whether it's their home life or their relationship life, like in the book Deeper Dating, or in your career. How does that impact you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know for myself, the lack of voice in childhood came across, just to start with, I guess, around family and around how lack of voice comes out in that way. I was taught to always ask permission.
Mm-hmm.
And I was never, I can't really think of times where it was like, well, Teresa, what would you like to do? Or what are your thoughts about this? Or what do you need right now? How do you feel about this plan? It was always like, if I think I want to do something, I need to first ask permission from the authority figures.
Right.
And it was like I had to get to a point where I actually had to realize, oh wait, I don't have to do that anymore. I'm like I'm a grown woman. So that's a way that it's come out with me in family life. And I know we could get into a whole bunch of things about relationships.
And that's a power thing, right? That's a personal power thing. It's almost like you're taught that you don't have a power very early on, and then you continue to maintain that. And you see that with women, especially with saying, I'm sorry all the time, right?
Oh,
That's a terrible habit that we tend to have.
Nice thing.
From a gender standpoint,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Or the fact that, like, you have to ask, or the way we buffer our asks, you know, using these submissive sort of words like just, or just saying, or whatever those words might be. So how has that impacted you in growing up? Because you kind of started off in this place, and you weren't taught to have a personal power, and it's no blame on your parents. Again,
right.
This is what we were taught as a culture. And then, you know, you go through life, and then where have you seen that impact? Like, maybe what are some examples of how that's impacted you? Maybe your success somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's funny because it goes in, it dives in deep into just even the little things where, you know, somebody will ask, like, what do you want to eat for dinner? I know that's like a common, you know, relationship question. Where do you want to go for dinner?
And you're like, wherever you want to go.
I know, it's like, I don't know, whatever you want is fine. And it's just like, it's just because I think part of it is, you know, you're just flexing that old muscle, and it is a strain to start flexing the muscle of, you know, I think I'm feeling like Thai food again. I know I feel Thai food like every night, but I think I'm just, you know, whatever it is, my body's craving it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that it, you know, I think that's like even just like the simplest and a really, really common way that that women will like invalidate or just won't even. I think it's kind of like when we start to ask ourselves, because what we're really getting at is, what do I want? That question. It's like, that is the power question, right? Is
right.
What do I want? And I think there's a lot of discomfort there that women have, because the second we start thinking about what we want, then, oh God, we're invalidating what someone else wants. And will they be happy about that? And I know
or will they like us?
Right. Exactly. It's like, will I, is wanting to get Chinese takeout going to be the death of my relationship?
Right. When we talk about it out loud, it seems silly, right?
Right.
But it's not. These are underlying mechanisms of the way we function through our deep subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you start to break those patterns? So that's in your relationship. And if you're doing that in your relationship to try to maintain that relationship, safety, and to not create any controversy or conflict, on the smallest levels, we're never really speaking our voice. But part of it is not recognizing, what do we want? Like you said.
Yeah. And then, that stuff builds up. So it's like, every time you say, I don't know, whatever you want, and you don't really mean it, because most of the time, like at a base level, at a subconscious level, like we don't really mean that. And it just builds itself up into these little tiny, resentments that explode over time over, something else trivial, that it wasn't that, it was all of this other stuff, but it was that lack of self, I don't want to say, like, I don't want to be really harsh about it. Like, I guess like lack of self-worth is coming up for me.
Or recognition.
Yeah.
But both of those, I'm so glad that you brought up the resentment component, because how many times has a woman gotten into a relationship, and I have these conversations with girlfriends, where they have these needs and they have these wants and desires, and they're so sweet and so kind all the time that it's like, no, whatever you want. And then all of a sudden they get tired of that, right? They go, say he wants to eat pizza all the time, and you're like, no, I want Thai. And then you make that change. And then the first time that he says, no, I don't want Thai, you're like, you've eaten pizza for like 100 times in the last 6 months, and I've eaten Thai like 0 times. And then it turns into this fight. Why? Because exactly what you said. It's these little resentments over time that you start to harbor against somebody else, when really it comes down to a frustration of not knowing how to speak and say and acknowledge first to yourself what your needs are, but then also to present it in a way that is received by the other person. Like, hey, you've eaten pizza 100 times in the last month. I think it's my turn to have Thai. If you're okay with that, I think it's okay. And however that you present that. But I think that it goes back to like when these resentments build up, and we're talking about relationships, but this happens in careers too.
I mean, this happens
in the
relationship.
workforce.
It's relationship with bosses. It's relationship with coworkers. It's relationship with parents. It's relationship with everything. Is relationship. If you're talking to another person, it's relationship. I mean, we call it career. We call it these different things. It's relationship with self too.
Right. First with self, and
Right.
That's the part that we forget. So the resentments kind of build up because a couple of things, right? Either we're not expressing ourselves to the point we're not expressing ourselves at all, for what our needs are, or we're not expressing ourselves maybe strong enough. We're like, maybe submissively expressing ourselves and saying, oh, but I'd like this, or, oh, if it's okay with you, but not saying it firm enough and saying, no, I'm tired of pizza and I want something different. Or, no, I'm the one who gets all these crummy projects at work, and how come, Bill or Jenny always gets like these better projects? And so to be able to express yourself in a firm and solid, yet, kind of sweet manner. And I don't mean sweet manner in the sense of like being submissive. There's this woman that I know, and when I meet her, she is the sweetest, kindest woman that I've ever met. And she works for one of the most successful men in Cleveland, for a $1 billion, individual. And it's not a sweet, kind, pushover sort of person that's in that position. But when you meet her, she will never say a harsh word against you. And she's always, her etiquette is, you know, just polished and perfect, very intelligent, and very expressive of what her needs are. But in that position, she comes across very powerful people all the time that maybe aren't as sweet with their delivery, right? And she can be as sweet as honey, but sting like a bee. In other words, she'll, you know, very eloquently put somebody in their place to say, you're crossing a line. This doesn't work for me. You're going to respect my boundaries, and I don't agree with you, or whatever she might be delivering. It's done in a very stern yet eloquent way. And I think that men have more practice doing this than women, especially if they're in a very political sort of environment. Not always, right? Because we see we see what's happening in the politics now, and sometimes it's not so eloquent. But I think some of our best speakers can deliver a message without having to badger, put down, demoralize, or call names. And if you can do that, I have the utmost respect for you. And if we can kind of pick those people out as mentors to say, that person is always respectful of another person, they are always perspective taking and empathetic to another person, and the fact that they're a human being, and yet they have firm enough boundaries to say, you're not going to step over me on me and rub your feet on me like a rug, sort of thing.
Yeah. And I know that's definitely a skill set that I am building myself, because I do like the aspects of my personality that are sweet and connected, and I yeah, like I like that aspect. I mean, there's certain aspects of myself that I like, that were developed through this like ask permission mentality that I don't want to see fall away. It's just a matter of, building the muscle, implementing that. It's so funny because it's still so foreign to me that I'm still learning how to like articulate it, to put it out there. But I know, like, so the first aspect of my life that I ever started playing around with this was in relationships, because I think that's where it can be the most obvious for a lot of us in terms of feeling like our boundaries are being crossed. And so I remember when I first started exercising this and I was seeing people, it did come across as very like, just like aggressive and very blunt and very like where is this all of a sudden coming from?
Right. It feels all of a sudden to the other person, but for you, it's been building up in this silo of resentment.
Yeah. It's been like putting a Mentos in a Coke bottle and like, it's like
exactly
blow the top off of it. And so it can come up in that way. And then it takes time to fizzle out. And I know, like, I'm going through the same thing right now with my parental relationship. I'm like, okay, I'm 32 years old. Like, it is time to, make the presence known to mom and dad that their daughter is a grown woman and is capable of making her own decisions, and refuses to be seen as a little girl anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's going to have its own ricochets and back and forth and certain, like, where is she coming from with this? It's so aggressive.
Right. It feels rebellious from their standpoint.
Having my 2-year-old rebellion where it's like, this isn't a rebellion. This is just exercising boundaries that I'm learning about. Yes.
And so there's a couple of things that you mentioned that really stand out. I love the fact that you refer to it as a muscle. It is a muscle. Habits can become muscles, and they become so ingrained we don't think about them, and it becomes easy, like going to the gym and working out, and you do the same exercises all the time. You're not challenging yourself anymore, right? But then at some point in time, those habits don't serve you. Maybe when you're little and you keep the peace at home, or maybe in some relationships, you have to make those decisions, but, not long-term and not pervasively, not in every aspect. there's got to be balance. There's times when you go, okay, bigger picture here, do I, make a big deal about this, even though this is what I really want? And you kind of go, big scheme of things, does it really matter?
Yeah.
And then there are other times where if it's repetitive activity and you're not, ever getting your needs met, then that's imbalance. And that's when that Coke bottle explodes. But when you practice it, when you first start practicing it, when you first start going, I have these needs, you woman, right? And then you start to feel self-empowered. And you start like inviting your tribe into your world where you feel like, I think this is an important aspect because of the way I was raised and because I was taught to be that way. I kept inviting people in my life that reiterated that you reinforced that sort of behavior from me. So I'd end up in these relationships where I was sweet and sweet and sweet and sweet. And then I got tired and then the Coke bottle exploded. And then they were like, well, who are you? And it's like, well, my resentment has built up and you don't listen to me. And this is where we're at. And then they think that you're not who you have pretended to be from their standpoint for a long time. But the reality is that you just didn't know how to have a voice. And the first time you have that voice, the first time you start to speak it out, it comes out so loud like a lion that it can be, like you said, aggressive and scary. So it's not a bad thing. Don't beat yourself up about that, right? Because I have beat myself up for not being perfect, and sometimes that perfection goes hand in hand with this. And then, then you kind of go, okay, what happened there? You kind of revisit that. And in the process of revisiting it, you go, I had my voice and I'm not going to be mad at myself for having a voice. However, I'm going to learn to be more eloquent with the way I deliver it, to be stern and to say, this is my line and I'm not tolerating this anymore. Doesn't work for me. Here are my needs. And if you can't respect me as a person and you can't respect my feelings, and this becomes a repetitive, redundant thing, and we've had this conversation over and over again, now that I am having a voice. And if you can't forgive me for that one, experience where I finally started to have my voice, then maybe you're not the person that should be in my life. And so what has happened for me is I had these people that were constantly stepping past my boundaries, always getting what they wanted, never respecting me as a separate person. And after reading that book, Deeper Dating, and I realized like, oh, I have these gifts. Like, you're an empath. I'm an empath. We like to be sweet, right? I don't want to change that about me. I like being nice to people, and I shouldn't have to, and you shouldn't have to. But I also want people to respect my boundaries, respect me as a person, and be in my life that is going to, call me up when they know something bad's going on, or, just kind of be there for me. So what happened is once I started to recognize what was inside of me, who I was as a person, the great gifts that God gave me and my contributions to the world, and I stopped invalidating them, and I stopped looking at them negatively because that's how my parents looked at them. And then that's how the men and the women and the friends and even coworkers looked at them. And I realized, you know what? Those are not the right people in my life. And as you start to value yourself and recognize those gifts within yourself, you'll start to recognize them in other people. And then all of a sudden, this beautiful thing transitions. And that beautiful thing that transitions is that the people that don't align with you and your gifts start to phase out of your life. And the people that align with you, and you're one of them, Teresa, I just, we really connected, the first time we chatted, and I'm excited that we're doing this conversation online. But then you start to meet these people that are very much in line with you. So sadly, sometimes when you have chaos in your life and we have people stepping over your boundaries, it's because they're nothing like you at their deepest core nature, because you've never recognized your own self. And so you recognize yourself. And now you start to bring in people like you in your life. And then that's where the village comes into play. When you have that village of people, you feel like you can express yourself without having to express yourself loudly. And people hear you because they also have respect for another human being. They perspective take, they have empathy. And then by having that empathy and inviting people in your life, then that muscle that you were talking about gets to grow stronger. And then as it grows stronger, now you can go back out into the world with people who maybe aren't as much like you and practice it more.
I love that. And I know, like, in my own, just to bring it back to, to give a little full circle on that relationship dinner analogy, I'm like, I know that I'm growing with this because I did, I called in a relationship where, he'll ask me like, what do you want for dinner? And I'll say, what do you want? And he'll be like, I asked you first. And he like will not let up on the fact that like, like I'm empowering you. Like I'm helping you empower
Aw.
yourself. And there's multiple examples of that, but I'm just like so grateful that that I was able to call that in. I'm like, okay, cool. I called it in one aspect of my life. I get to call it in different, because just because it comes in one place doesn't mean it necessarily comes in everywhere all at once, or that we're even ready to take it on. Because I think for a lot of us, it can be like too much. Like I know
Mm-hmm.
for myself, and I know that there's evidence of this in like CEOs and upper level management, of like we kind of have like a finite number of decisions a day, and you can get, especially as an empath or as a sensitive person, you can get decision fatigue.
Right.
And so I do have those times with him where I'm just like, no, I can't make this decision right now. It is so trivial to me. And I can't, I'm like out of decision making juice for
Right. Right.
that's
Done.
part of
Fatigue.
building that muscle up too,
Mm-hmm.
is building your like decision making muscle up a little bit more.
Right.
And some of it comes around to like removing decisions for yourself, like picking clothes out the night before, or just implementing habits so that it doesn't become a decision anymore. And so I bring that up because I know that's part of my process with finding my voice, is also finding finding everything that works for me in terms of what's going to empower me most to use that voice around routines and habits, and awareness around how many decisions am I really capable of making in a day.
Right. Or even the fact that it's part of that decision making process is in the beginning, you have to protect your boundaries, right? First, you have to develop your boundaries. That's the first,
Define them, even just
right. You have to,
what
right.
are they?
Exact. And that's like really getting in tune with the way you feel. Do I like this? Do I not like this? Do I care? Do I not care?
What do
Like
I
even the
want?
decision of,
Yeah.
right, exactly. And then once you kind of figure that out, then you can start to build your boundaries. And boundaries aren't walls. Boundaries
Right.
are permeable. Like things can get in and things can get out. It's not like completely closed off. And so then you establish them. But then the other thing is like you have to protect them. And my youngest son, he's really great. He's really into this stuff. We have these conversations too. And I love the way he talks about this. He talks about it, and there's a particular, and I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. There's somebody who speaks on this regularly. I just did a post on Facebook about it, and I will post something after this on his name. But he talks about having your sword. And your sword is like really big in the beginning. That's kind of like that Coke bottle exploding. You're like, no, leave me alone, or no, that doesn't work. And then as you start to get more eloquent with your words, the sword gets smaller and smaller. And then eventually you don't need the sword. And really what that is that's you're not trying to attack people. You're not trying to hurt people, but you're trying to protect yourself.
Right. It is
Yes.
protection, because you're like, okay, my boundaries keep me safe. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
you get to, and the thing about boundaries, because the easiest boundaries for me to recognize were physical. So like, okay, you're too close to me. I don't want to touch you. Please don't touch me. So those were
Right.
the first boundaries that I was able to recognize. The ones I'm getting into now that I think a lot of us, I didn't even used to think of as boundaries, are like, who am I going to take advice from on what? Whose
Yes.
opinion am I going to
Yes.
invite in and allow to impact, whose advice? It's basically like, who am I going to, whose authority am I going to allow on particular subjects? And I had to come to that with my parents of like, okay, I'm not going to let them have any say on my business and my finances. And
That's a great
but
first step.
whatever decisions I make around that are mine. And I'm not even, I'm not going to ask them about it anymore. I'm not going to bring it up to them about it anymore. That part of my life, like other parts of our lives that are more intimate, like I'm keeping separate.
Compartmentalizing. Yes.
And that's been huge for me, because I used to, like, like I said, I raised asking permission. And so it's like you get to a place where you're like, this is my money. Why am I asking permission to use it on X, Y, Z?
Right.
Or to do what I want with it. And that was like, that in the last year, that's like been a huge like revelation for me.
Right. And I think there's a scary part of that, right? There's a scary part of like, oh, I'm doing this on my own. So part of that breaking away and part of that establishing boundaries is that, oh, I'm an independent person, which means I make these decisions by myself. And so part of growing up is like making more decisions by yourself. And that's okay. You go through this scary phase. So you want to be able to rely on other people, but you know that once you're empowered, that I can make all these decisions on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And if I need to go back for some advice that is warranted, asked for advice, then it's different. And then I think time is another aspect of that. Like you talked about, physical boundaries, and then you talked about, the advice boundary, and then there's the time boundary. I think sometimes people will really consume your time, and whether that's in relationships because they want to hang out with you, but they don't want anything serious, or even in the work environment where like they're asking you to do extra duties to help them out and free up their time. But now you're stuck at the office for later hours. And so that's, I think, another boundary. A boundary for me that I'm really practicing, and it's probably been the toughest for me to shift, is my feelings, for people to respect my feelings and to respect that I have a different perspective. Like there's this thing called phenomenology in psychology, and phenomenology means that if you have 10 people that watch a car accident from 10 different positions of where that car accident happened, they're all going to see different aspects. And it does, in a police report, you'll get 10 different stories that are subtly different. And it doesn't necessarily mean that any of them are wrong. It means that from their place in viewing that, and there are biases, and there are experiential reasons, and there's historical reasons, and there's, just line of sight reasons as to why people see things differently or feel differently about an experience. And just having to say that, no, just because I disagree with the perception of what transpired, it doesn't mean that if you disagree with me, I'm wrong. And so that's one of my biggest boundaries right now, is to say, I respect that you have your own views, and I honor that. And I validate that. But what I have a challenge with is sometimes people aren't as validating or understanding, or, take the same sort of empathy standpoint or perspective taking standpoint as I have really been focusing on to try to do with other people. And you see this politically in our, and religiously, globally, how it's like, I'm right and you're wrong. And what people don't realize is that is a boundary issue. Everyone's perspective can be validated, even if you don't agree with them. And there's a great book out there actually that taught me about this, and it's called Getting the Love You Want by Harville Hendricks. And this book is great from the standpoint that it really teaches people how to communicate in an empathetic way, where you listen to somebody, you truly listen. And he teaches you techniques on how to really listen to a person. This is interesting from the standpoint in terms of communication. I think this is where a lot of people drop the ball on communication. I've done it a million times. And since I read the book, I've tried to make the change. So what he talks about, and I think this is so relevant to today and the polarization of the world. When we listen, we hear what we want to hear, or we hear the words in the way they make sense to us. He gives a great example in the book, Getting the Love You Want, by saying, like, he's a marriage counselor, to give you some background on it. He did typical conventional marriage counseling, and then got a divorce himself, and was teaching in a college, and literally felt like a failure, because he's like, how can I teach this stuff when it's not successful and it has the lowest success rates? of all therapy. And so what happened was he ended up meeting a woman who was a psychologist as well, or her counselor, marriage counselor. And they ended up writing this book together because they learned a new technique. And it's about finding your imago match. And the imago match is some combination of your parents. It's a really great book, actually. It's some combination of your parents, good and bad. And that's why we pick our partners. And so they say there's 3 reasons why. 1, commonalities. 2, because some of their opposites are positives and our strengths, and vice versa. And then also serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin go crazy. Well, why does that happen? Because you can meet a million people, and then all of a sudden you meet one person, and then, like, fireworks explode. Why? Yeah. And it's because there's some combination of your parents. So through the mannerisms and their voice inflection and the way they walk and a lot of things, our deep psychological mind says, ding, 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 you're the person. Why? Because we have these deep psychological wounds that need to be healed from childhood, where we didn't get our needs met, not because our parents are bad, just because we're all different human beings. And maybe we don't know how to listen better.
Or how to ask.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so what he teaches is he recognizes that it's that communication that's the challenge. So now that I've given you a little bit of history, back to the communication part. And the communication, what he says is that he gives an example. There's this married couple. They both love to play tennis. And they get out on the tennis court, and every single time, they came from tennis families. So every single time, it's like this huge blowout World War III fight. And they have been counseling. They're like, why does this keep happening? And what he finds is, like, in marriages, people tend, in relationships of all sorts, they tend to have the same arguments over and over and over and over. It could be about a different topic, but it's the same argument. Why? So with this example, he said in the guy's family, it was a very competitive tennis family. So they get out there. It's all about, like, who wins. I'm going to kick your butt, and there's, there's no sacrificing for fun. It's all about the competitiveness. And then the wife, she, like, they get out there, and her tennis family, like, they volley the ball, they laugh and they giggle, they take breaks, they joke around. They don't even take score. They could care less. It's about the activity and their socializing. And so even though they're using the same words, let's go play tennis, their concept of tennis from that family micro society in what those words mean are completely polarized. And so he said, he teaches a technique on how to communicate with other people. And if you can communicate where you can actually repeat back what the other person is saying verbatim, and then say, this is what that means to me, or this is what I think you're saying. And they can either validate that or invalidate that. And then you could say, this is what that means to me. Like, it's so funny. Game changer.
This reminds me of, so I took improv classes at an acting school for like 3.5 years, and the acting school teaches this technique called Meisner. And if you're not familiar with Meisner, it is literally all based on listening and repeating back what somebody's saying and reacting off of the other person. So when you said that back to me, I'm like, oh, they've put Meisner into relationships, which I actually have a friend who's interested in going to school for counseling because he's done the Meisner technique and he wants to support people with this. He's like, it's all communication and it's all relationship, and developing like an authentic communication cadence with somebody, whether you're acting or not. So that's really interesting to me that's just a technique that works in varying different avenues. But it makes sense to me that if you can really embody what and say back to somebody what they're really saying and really think about it, it does sink in. It allows it to actually sink in and feel into it, and really be able to like hear the person, even though you think you might hear them, but you're not really hearing their body language and hearing their tone and hearing their everything. And it's recentering the focus. If both people can center the focus on each other, to help shine that light on each other. Yeah, I mean, gosh, the world would be a totally different place.
Right. And you can have differences of opinions, but really, and I think this is kind of pervasive throughout this entire talk. And that is a sense of being heard and being seen, right? Because that's empowerment. I mean, even Black Lives Movement or sex slavery or things that are going on in Beijing, every religious polarization, political polarization, all the stuff that's going on, it seems like very egotistical. It's, this is what I believe, this is what matters, what you believe doesn't matter. That if we stop and we say, let me understand you better, because maybe we're using the same words, but they mean something different. And I should recognize that you're a person and validate that your feelings and your thoughts and you're here for a purpose. You have a contribution to the world, and that's empowerment. So to me, a lot of these things that are going on in the world is a sense of lack of empowerment, where people are disempowering others. Right. And that's what we're saying by having a voice as women. Like I want to feel like my voice matters. I matter. My feelings matter. Even if you disagree with me or you don't completely understand the way I feel, because maybe there's a gender difference or a religious difference, that's okay. But don't invalidate me as a person, because that's the same thing as erasing me. Like I'm not even here. And I grew up in an environment where that's a sensitivity to me, because I was invisible to my parents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know I was very good at being quiet and playing by myself and not making too much disruption or noise, because like as a sensitive kid, like honestly, like I liked quiet, and I didn't like to disrupt the peace. So if my needs weren't getting met, first of all, I didn't know how to articulate that. And then there was that fear in me that if I did articulate that, that was going to make the home life loud and abrasive, and exactly the types of things that I wanted to avoid by, going along to get along, for sure.
Avoiding conflict.
Yes.
Sometimes having a voice, you're afraid of that conflict component. And conflict's okay, as long as it's done respectfully. And I think a lot of women are nervous of conflict. Maybe there's a fear of getting hurt, whether it's physically or emotionally.
Yeah.
Right. But conflict, I think that you would appreciate that book from a lot of different standpoints, but like how our childhood really did set us up for our behaviors in adulthood. But also the fact that conflict only means that two people are probably miscommunicating. Either they're not communicating what they truly mean, or the other person's not receiving what the other person is trying to say. But it really is just two people, they're bumping heads because they don't understand each other. They don't understand intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, from a perspective that's outside of their own. And once, like my son and I, we just had like kind of intense conversation last night, my youngest son and I, and then when I started doing that mirroring technique that I learned, the interesting thing was, and he felt like he wasn't being heard, and he felt like I was disempowering him. And I would never want to do that to anybody. So then when I stopped and I said, it sounds like this is what you're saying, and these are the words that you're using, and this is what it means to me, we realized that he wasn't saying what he was trying to say. And so I was perceiving what he was saying as something that, he was trying to change my mind, or not valuing, my beliefs. And then once we got past that, this communication block that happens, like it dissolved, and then we literally came together and connected. And there's something really beautiful about that. And then we walked away and we go, oh wow, that's kind of a conversation that we've had more than once. You go round and round. But when people go round and round, it's just because they're not hearing one another. They're disempowering each other. And when you empower the other person, when you recognize the other person, when you see the other person, everything changes. And I think that this is a message that the entire world can really, if we just stop and listen, it can be impactful in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, for sure. So yeah, so I think you gave a pretty good, because I was about to get into like, so how can we help people to start facilitating conversations in a different way? Because it feels like that's a lot of it. But in starting with yourself, like how do we, first of all, like, is not having a voice, was it something that you didn't recognize for a long time and had to like,
Absolutely.
yeah, so like what are the steps that people can even take to like, because we all, awareness is the first step to solving any problem. You have to know that there's a problem and actually diagnose that there is a problem. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we talked a little bit at the beginning about some of the pain points of it being, the in feeling invisible, feeling invalidated, um, feeling small, feeling like we're not listened to. And I'm just like walking through this for myself, because it's like, so when we get to that place where we realize it, how can we step into more analyzing it and starting to practice it in our daily lives?
Well, I think that's a great question. Thanks for asking that, because I think that a lot of people can have opinions, a lot of people can have information, but if you can't like give people a process to start kind of investigating how to grow, like, then it's just information. And so I think that's a great question from the standpoint is like, where do people go from here? Like, say you're a woman or a man or an African American person that like, hey, my voice matters. What's the next steps that I take from here? And so the first one is recognizing what matters to you, which is exactly what's happening in this Black Lives Matter movement. Like, that's it. I matter. My feelings matter. And so
My
what
life
are
matters.
my life matters,
Like,
right?
or general perspective, like, stop killing me. Like,
Right, exactly. And even just the subtle disrespects. Remember we talked about it earlier, like all these subtleties, like the subtleties of using certain words or the subtleties of the way we behave. And so it's so pervasive. So the first thing is going, how do I feel? And the little things is like, do I like chocolate ice cream or do I like, vanilla ice cream, and really recognizing that seems silly, but sometimes you have to have the time to sit with yourself. I think that's another thing that I see happening with people is they stay so busy all the time and they stay surrounded by people all the time. Like, you can't know yourself if you never have time with yourself. And some people are so afraid to be alone that they don't take the time to be with themselves to learn who they are. So I think that's the number one first step, is that you've got to reconnect with self. By reconnecting with self, then from there you figure out, these are my feelings, this is what I like and this is what I don't like. And then when you go out into the world with other people, you've got to surround yourself with, again, your village, those people who are like you, those people that you can cry in front of, and you can have, not the best day, maybe you're a little irritable, you're PMSing, whatever, maybe you kind of like, you're not polished, right?
mm-hmm.
And then there are days when you're happy. So who are those people that you can have that fluctuation of not being your best self and then also being like you're like in the zone, your top self, and they still love you and they still respect you and they do not judge you and you do not judge them. So you got to get rid of judgment, and you have to have compassion for yourself and for others. And when you find that village of people, those friends, and maybe you have to start completely over. I had to start completely over. I literally had no real close friends. I had acquaintances. I've always had lots of acquaintances, but I never had any real like inner circle people. And now I have this amazing inner circle group of people where literally I can be me, all, like bedhead, just worked out, crazy, messy, PMSing me. They still love me and they're forgiving, and of course there's respect that goes back and forth there, and they can rely on me that way. Then from there, you can practice in a safe way of having a voice, because they respect your boundaries, you respect their boundaries. You can have open conversations with no judgment. And that's where you have a safe place to practice. And then, like you said, you don't want to inundate yourself once you get out there. You don't want to go hang out with an old circle of friends that are all like egotistical, constantly putting each other down, you know, instead of elevating each other, you step on each other. But you've got to go into probably some work environments or some family environments that aren't healthy. Just kind of slowly ease yourself into that and learn maybe some skills or techniques by practicing prior to. I know my mom is always in, my business about what I'm doing for my financials or what I'm doing with my business, right? Because that's what you mentioned. And so before you put yourself in that situation, think about, like, I know she's going to say this one thing. She always says like, what's going on with your financials? Are you saving money? Whatever those conversations are. And maybe list out, like, okay, when she says this, what am I feeling? I feel violated. I feel like it's my business. I feel, okay, so then you really just put down those raw words of what that is and what you're feeling. So recognizing it. And then you're like, how do I take that raw energy, which might not be so kind to say out loud, and turn it into a polished, etiquette way, eloquent way of stating those feelings in a way that's not hurtful to the other person, right? So like, maybe it could be like, Mom, I really appreciate what you are trying to accomplish, but I'm practicing being an adult and I really want to see how I can do it on my own. Do you see how neutral that is? My youngest son, again, who's into this sort of stuff, talks about the neutrality of words. And when you say things in a way that come across attacking, like, I don't like you being in my business. Like, it's my business. Leave me alone. Like, that can feel attacking. It can be hurtful to the other person because they care about you. That's the only reason they're getting involved. And it could be damaging to relationships. But when you find that neutral way of saying exactly the same thing and almost putting like a positive, that little sweet honey on top of it without losing that power. So you don't want to be so sweet to be like, oh, thanks, Mom, you're right, right? There's no power in that. But if you say, Mom, I really appreciate you. I love you. I know you care about me, like recognizing their feelings, recognizing why they're doing that, seeing them as a person first. That really is helpful for establishing your boundaries, because now you're establishing that they're separate from you. And then you put your line in the sand down and you say, but I'm trying to be the best adult that I can be. And I'd like to see how I do this on my own first. And I'd like for you to support me in doing that. Do you think you can? It's not submissive. You're literally saying, here's my role. Here's my line. This is what I'm going to do. Are you supporting me in doing that? And it's very different communication. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you can prepare for those environments, and those are like inner circle things, right? You start with your innermost circle, yourself, and then your closest friends or your new village. And then you work your way out to those people that you feel less safe with, but you begin, instead of that big sword of attacking, you have this little, you have this little like wax on, wax off hand movement of like, no, block, not going to happen. And then from there, you can go out into the real world. And then when you meet a guy, like you mentioned, physical boundaries, I've been on dates where guys try to grope and you're like, hey, not appropriate. And you're going to meet those crummy people, or maybe like in a work environment where people say things that are completely inappropriate. I had, a partner at one point in time who said some really nasty things, and it was completely inappropriate. And I didn't have the voice at the time to say, you can't talk to me that way. Mm-hmm. I did block it and say, let's move on to something different. But I did not defend and lay a ground rule. So it's going to take time. It's going to take practice. But to do it you've got to prep for it. And then eventually, like you said, it's a muscle. Over time, that muscle gets stronger. And then you just become witty at like, wax on, wax off. Haha, no, not going to happen.
See, I knew asking you that question would be gold, because you're so process oriented. And you're like, of course, yes, here's the step by step. I'm like, awesome. Great. Like, I think wherever somebody is right now, in this process and listening to this, and it's like, you can be, like I said, you can be up here with one area of your life and still be back down here. Like we're talking about, where it's like you're working on your inner circle up here, but down here we've got, neighbors, and we're not ready to go there. Neighbors.
Right.
So we're in, we're in fluxing different phases with it. And I know, like, the word, I don't know, my favorite word of this season, that keeps coming back to me is flow. Just flow with it. Like, it's, it's not going to be a perfect, step-by-step process with everything. But with that awareness and with starting to practice those things and flub on them and have awkward moments with them, you can slowly over time, like I said, grow those muscles. Just like with the gym, like we have our setbacks. My setback being I'm not going to the gym during coronavirus. I'm working on, like, how do I strength train from home? That's one thing I'm still wrapping my head around. I've got cardio down, but yeah. So it's just, I always look to end these sessions just also reflecting on, like, just compassion for ourselves, just because it's something that I notice that I struggle with myself in using my voice. And it's just so important to be like, okay, that didn't go as I intended.
Yeah.
To give ourselves the grace of that moment to really reflect and be like, but we're trying new stuff. And trying new stuff can be a little bit sloppy.
Scary, intimidating. Yes.
Everybody's bad at something new.
They're so bad. I think to that point, you bring up a good point. I think that you can start this process, right? It's going to be sloppy. Have compassion with yourself. Also remember, what's that internal dialogue? Because that internal dialogue is also what is reinforcing bad habits. So if you were invalidated as a child, if you were invalidated in your relationships, that ego is probably running a recording in your head, invalidating yourself on a regular basis. And you're not going to be successful until you change that dialogue first. You have to change that. So I beat myself up. I would end up in these cycles of, like, constantly just beating myself up for saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing but not being perfect. Right. And I changed that. And I'm going to be really vulnerable here and tell you, that my dialogue is in support of the little girl in me, and we're all still little girls. And I will talk to myself like, hey, baby girl, it's okay. Like, not something to get that upset about. And that is the greatest compassion that you can give to yourself. Do not beat yourself up. That's going to be hard to do. But instead, talk to yourself as though you were talking to a small child. And that may sound silly, but it is so loving and so caring. And you start to fill up your cup from the inside out. And when you treat yourself good, then you will not expect anything less from others. Brené Brown talks a lot about this. She talks about, she's fantastic. If you haven't seen her, ladies, guys out there,
she's the reason amazing. I brought up the first time. She has a thing called effing first time.
I haven't seen that one.
She talks about it on her podcast, but it's basically like, just got to call it out by name. It's my first time doing something, and it's going to be sloppy and it's going to be vulnerable. Because first times are very vulnerable.
Yeah, she did that first TED Talk video. And when she did that TED Talk video, she literally did exactly what I had just described. She went back and said, what did I just do publicly? And millions of people just saw that. I cannot believe I was that vulnerable. And, finding yourself and speaking your voice, there is vulnerability with that. And you're going to have that compassion.
Well, look at her now. Like, she is the poster child for vulnerability, and she will self-proclaim that she hates vulnerability still. That she struggles with it, that it is like one of her least favorite things to work with still, but it's like, that's the real work. That's the work we all get to do. And God, I would be so lucky to be like a poster child for vulnerability at some point, because I'm like, that's where I'm going with it.
Yeah.
I know, but it's the real stuff. It's like, what are we talking about if we're not talking about the real stuff? Then we're just talking about the surface. And you can't really facilitate real change unless you break through the surface, you know?
Yes.
And so we need to be having these vulnerable conversations to show other women it's okay to have these conversations publicly, and that people will actually be drawn to you for it. It'll magnetize you. I think there's a myth around that, or a myth that we tell ourselves with vulnerability, that if I am vulnerable, they will see me for, you know, term for imposter syndrome here. Like,
right. I think other people would love to be that way, be vulnerable. It is hard to be vulnerable at first, but it's freeing too, isn't it? Like the first few times you do, when you do it and you do it around the wrong people, then it's painful. But when you invite the right people in your life and you dance like nobody's watching and you sing like nobody's singing and you say, I don't like chocolate or whatever it is, and you just kind of, you're yourself, and people support that and they're like, yeah, whatever, she doesn't like that. You know, and then you're like, oh, it's okay. I don't have to like everything that everybody else likes. It is so freeing. And then like, it's almost like this blossoming flower, right? It reminds me of the lotus, like coming out of the mud, and then you just turning into this beautiful flower.
I could talk about this forever for sure, but we should probably wrap it up. Tammy, how can people find you?
You can find me in a couple of different ways. Well, you can find me on my social media sites, Tammy Polenz, Veda's Living. And you can also find me Twitter. And then I work in design for levelheads.us. We create healthy spaces, and then vedasliving.com, which is a community of women leaders, women thought leaders, which you're a part of.
Yes.
And it's in its infancy and just starting, but the goal is to put out more information like this to help to elevate women. It doesn't mean it's only strictly for women. You know, I think this could be beneficial for men, but please, you know, find me there and partake in some of our future events, which we're planning now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tammy. Until next time, I'm sure we'll have another conversation soon.
Sounds good.
Take care.
Bye, Teresa.